the apostle labors here is that this decision is not with a view to anything that they had done or would do. The point is that the decision is not only made prior to their birth, that would be manifestly obvious, but what Paul labors here is that it is not with a view to their doing any good or evil, but Paul uses this illustration to show that the purposes of God might stand, so that it does not rest on us, but it rests solely on the gracious, sovereign decision of God. Now, in verse 14, we read these words, "What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not." Or other translations read, "God forbid," and still others, "by no means." Now, I find it fascinating that Paul raises this rhetorical question immediately after setting forth his metaphor of the birth of Jacob and Esau and the preference of God for one rather than the other without a view to their works. I remember when I was a seminary student and deeply struggling over the doctrine of election, as most seminary students do. And there was just something that didn't fit with me. It didn't sit right at all to think that God dispenses his saving grace to some and not to others, and that the reason for giving some salvation and not to others doesn't rest in us, but solely in the determinate grace of God. That bothered me, because my initial response was, this just doesn't seem to be fair. And I thought, how can this be fair that God would choose to save some and not others? Now, I understood that nobody deserved salvation in the first place. And I know that if God would let the whole human race perish, he would be perfectly just so to do. And I also understood by then that the only way we could ever be saved at all was somehow by the grace of God. But I certainly didn't think it rested this heavily on the grace of God. And I thought, why would God give his grace to some people in a greater measure than he would to others? It just didn't seem fair to me. And as I struggled with it and read Edwards and the other Reformed theologians, I still wasn't convinced, and I had a little card I had on my desk in seminary, and it said this: "You are required to believe and to preach what the Bible says is true, not what you would like it to say is the truth." And that put some restraints on me, because I read this passage every conceivable way, and I knew that there were people who said, well, Paul's not really talking about the election of individuals here. He's talking about the benefits of salvation that were given to the Jews rather than the Arabs, and he's talking about nations that are chosen, not individuals. That didn't persuade me for 5 minutes, because even if he were talking about nations, he illustrates it by the individuals who are at the head of that nation. So no matter how you slice it, you're still back down here wrestling with one person receiving a blessing from God and the other person not. And it's based ultimately on the good pleasure of God himself, and it still seemed not right. Now, I've written lots of books and I've taught lots of courses, and I know that when I set a thesis forth, that if I've done that often enough, you have enough practice that you can almost anticipate, or you can anticipate, not almost, but altogether anticipate the objections or the questions that people will immediately raise to a certain thesis. And at this point, at least, one of the few points I can identify with the Apostle Paul as a teacher is here, because the apostle, when he was setting forth this doctrine, anticipated a response or a question. He no sooner spells out the sovereign grace that is given to Jacob over Esau, that he stops and says, what then? Is there unrighteousness in God? And one of the things that persuaded me that the reformers had it right with respect to election was contemplating this very question. Because I thought like this, if Paul is trying to teach a semi-Pelagian